Recording. Okay. Bom, boa tarde a todos e todas presentes. Nós do FAPS agradecemos a presença de todos os alunos que estão aqui e hoje nós temos a companhia do professor Fred Andersson, que é professor da Fred, help me, Abo University Akademi.
That's very good. Very good.
Thank you. Então, professor da Abo Akademi na Finlândia, que é a única universidade finlandesa em língua sueca. Eles são vizinhos, né? Mas tem essas questões interessantes assim. O Fred é no caso, um amigo já de quase 10 anos. Eu encontro em situações de semiótica visual, coisa assim. Né? Ele vai falar, o tema da fala dele é a relação próxima e problemática, entre semiótica visual e história da arte. Então, semiótica visual e história da arte. Ele é professor associado de História da Arte e Estudos Visuais na universidade que eu citei, o Abo Akademi, numa cidade medieval, né, que se chama Abo, ou então Turku. Né? Ele tem na foto do perfil que ele mandou para a gente, dá para ver uma vista da cidade. Ele também administra uma pequena fazenda da família na Suécia, além de ser um professor universitário. Ele pôs isso na biodata dele, eu acredito que ele considera importante marcar, porque, inclusive, algumas vezes ele já trouxe em falas dele, ele traz alguma questão em relação à fazenda, a pequena fazenda. Não é fazenda brasileira, né, gente? É fazenda sueca e pequena para padrões suecos. Bom, então, ele é chefe do departamento nessa universidade, ele publica em sueco, inglês, já desde o começo dos anos 90, tem algumas publicações traduzidas em japonês, em português, fez seu doutorado, né, mestrado-doutorado na Suécia, em Lund, e tem várias publicações na Nordic, do Conselho Editorial da Nordic Review of Iconography, e também do jornal da AISV, que é a Associação Internacional de Semiótica Visual. O jornal se chama Visio, né, Visio, se for em francês. Bom, então ele trabalha com arte e visualidade. Também o Ivan já colocou no chat uma entrevista que ele deu para a revista online Nueva Sociedade a respeito da tradição iconográfica dos movimentos de esquerda no cenário internacional. É uma grande alegria para nós podermos recebê-lo e eu vou passar a palavra a ele agora para vocês poderem desfrutar do tempo com ele. So, Fred, we are very happy to have you here. I hope one day we manage to have you in person. I think the first time I tried it was about 8 years ago that I tried to see if you could come, if you're interested in coming when we had a program here, and it was not possible for you at the moment. Anyway, so we're very happy, very glad to have you here, and the floor is yours. Please feel free. If we feel it is too small, if we see it is too small, I'll ask you. I'll make a sign or something like that and ask you to project the full screen, let's say, of PowerPoint. Okay?
Yes.
The floor is yours. You asked me to talk to them. No, I propose to talk to them about starting as a conversation, as a discussion. Would you like me to propose this to them?
No, I think it is okay to do according to your usual plan, actually.
Okay.
Conference plus discussion. We said that I will speak here for approximately 1 hour, so I will do that. And I have prepared rather many slides, I must say, unfortunately. Now I suddenly lost the background sound. It feels a little spooky because I cannot see you either. Voila! Thank you very much for that introduction, and you have told everything about me that is worth telling, I think. The title of this speech actually is the problematic relationship between visual semiotics and art history, but it could have many other titles also, and actually this topic is enormous, so I'm not quite sure if I will manage to do it justice. It could also have the title of something like A Grammar of Visual Art, A Grammar of Plastic Art, because what I will talk to is rather much that early in art history, early art historians in Germany, as I will show soon, were often speaking of studying visual art in terms of grammar, but probably at least partly grammar in quite different visual sense from the grammar of linguistics, structural linguistics, and the work of Saussure, which, as we all know, was one of the main sources of the development of semiotics as a modern discipline. So, but what do we actually mean with all this? What do we mean with grammar? What do we mean with art? What do we mean with visual and plastic? And I ended up with this little graphical sign of confusion, because we could talk about visual art, we could talk about what semioticians have sometimes referred to as the plastic level of visual art, but then they use plastic in a very different sense from how many art historians use the term plastic. Why do we have to talk about art at all? It seems quite limited. We could instead speak of visual culture. We could add an anthropological perspective. If there is a semiotics of what semioticians call the plastic in art, it is probably rather a semiotic of visual space, of social space, probably cultural space, and so on and so forth. So, as you see, it is not even very, very easy to put a proper rubric or headline for a speech like this. I have promised that I will try to do the following two things. I think it was the abstract. Quote, how the identification of a secondary or semi-symbolic visual system termed plastic language or langage plastique in the sometimes conflicting work of the Grammar School and the group Minha can be productively connected to Meyer Schapiro's earlier analysis of medieval ecclesiastical art and pictorial conventions. So there you have something I have attempted to do in an article, a comparison between research in visual semiotics and the specialized branch of semiotics that we have come to call visual semiotics, and in art history. And these are different fields and networks of research that too seldom have contact and interaction, I think. And secondly, that I think that many proposed models for understanding visual semiotics still suffer from an a prioristic and cultural bias that should be resolved by means of interdisciplinary dialogue. And that the promising prospect there also lies in more connection to anthropology and probably archaeology, and what at German universities is often called Bildwissenschaft, translate roughly as studies of the image or science of the image even. So my own research, speaking about the interview that was made by me in an Argentinian leftist magazine, has been during the last 5 years merely into iconology and more specifically the political iconology of the labor movement, international labor movement. So quite recent history. And therefore I first show here just briefly this famous table from Erwin Panofsky's Studies in Iconology from 1939. Because Erwin Panofsky and his theory of iconology is probably the kind of art history that most frequently has been compared to semiotics. Why? Because you can see here that Panofsky differentiates between 3 levels or 3 stages in the interpretation of art or any visual material. And let's see here if this laser, yes, this works. Those levels are what he calls the primary subject matter, the secondary subject matter, and thirdly the intrinsic meaning, which is a little bit more complicated and which according to Panofsky is iconological interpretation proper. But the most obvious connection to semiotics here is that iconological studies of pictures properly starts only at the second or secondary level, because there it has to do with certain coded levels of the image, which is called iconography. That is what is called iconography. Then elements like symbols, like attributes, for example, of various saints and mythological figures that you cannot recognize without cultural knowledge. So there comes in a more obvious connection to semiotics of culture and cultural coding. But if we then, like certain semioticians, like members of the Greimas school and also the Belgian group Me, would like to claim that also the primary level in this division of Panofsky is semiotic, then we run into quite peculiar difficulties, because that level is usually seen not as semiotic in that more limited sense, but more as aesthetic, as natural, even biological, or whatever you have it. Not as semiotic in that sense.
Sorry, Fred. Sorry to interrupt you. We still have the first slide only. We didn't test if we could see the change of slides.
That is indeed a problem. Then we test,
okay. Now we can see the fourth.
Then we test full screen instead.
Okay. Because you talked about, especially the third slide, where there is a lot of information about Panofsky. Mm-hmm.
Now you see yourselves. Now you see
a tunnel, an infinite tunnel.
The infinite tunnel. Now you see my presentation.
Yes.
What do you see now?
The presentation, I believe it's slide 4. I'm not sure. You have.
What do you see now?
According to Bryson, 1983. Here, the one first slide.
A grammar of visual plastic art.
Yes. Now how the identification, etc. and all.
How the identification. Erwin Panofsky Studies in Iconology.
Yes.
A model for a differentiation between different levels. But I don't know how well versed you are in art history, or how specific I have to be. But the way iconology as a specific branch of art history has developed, it has been seen as mainly the study of content, not the study of form. So there is like a constant tension in the field of art history all through the 20th century between proponents of the analysis of form in art and proponent more aesthetic analysis of form, probably, and the iconologists following Panofsky, stressing the study of content. I guess the semiotic take on that could be that you really cannot separate form and content. Because according to very basic definition of science, a sign is like an amalgam, a unit of form and content, influencing each other. Well, semiotics was not a big thing in art history, at least not in the English-speaking Anglophone countries until the 1980s, when people like Mieke Ball, who is actually originally not art historian, but professor of comparative literature in Holland, and Norman Bryson, an English art historian, published such things as the quite, in art history circles, quite famous article, Semiotics and Art History, that was published in the Art Bulletin in 1991, as you can see. And they here made some quite striking claims. According to some, for example me, they provided a quite reductive and simplified account of semiotics and what semiotics is. I have put out here two quotes, which I think are quite remarkable and typical. The first one is actually the first sentence of their article. They write, quote, "The basic tenet of semiotics, the theory of sign and sign use, is anti-realist," end of quote. So if we take that at face value, it would probably exclude much of the Persian tradition in semiotics. It would not be semiotics proper because it's not anti-realist or nominalist or Saussurean or something like that. Then they also claim that the semiotic perspective has been long present in art history. Quote, "The work of Riegel and Panofsky can be shown to be congenial to the basic tenets of Peirce and Saussure, and key texts of Meyer Schapiro deal directly with issues in visual semiotics," end of quote. So there they mention Meyer Schapiro, and Meyer Schapiro could be counted as one of the pioneers of visual semiotics, actually, because he was the only art historian, internationally known art historian in his generation, who explicitly, who wrote papers, published articles explicitly related to semiotics. But that was in the 1950s and 1960s. So they also claim that the work of older art historians, or more well-known art historians like Riegel and Panofsky, also has affinity to semiotics. And I think it can fairly be said that Ball and Bryson never really demonstrate that in this article. And therefore I have been thinking for this presentation it could be interesting to look a little more closely into the specific example of Riegel, the Austrian art historian Alois Riegel, active around the turn of the century 1900. But first, to put it more into context, I think it's important to know about this relationship between semiotics and art history, that the likes of Norman Bryson and Mieke Ball launched their variety of visual semiotics or semiotics of the art as a criticism of what they regarded as traditional art history. And this was all connected to kind of a movement of what was then often called new art history in Anglophone countries in the 1980s. The early books by Norman Bryson were formative in this respect, and probably especially Norman Bryson's book Vision and Painting, The Logic of the Gaze, from 1983. Now I have to check, can you still see the right slide? It is
Yes,
working?
yes,
Yes, that's
and
good.
even a pointer
Even the
that
pointer.
you're using now. Yes.
So this book was basically quite straightforward attack against older art historians like Erwin Panofsky and more implicitly Meyer Schapiro and others in that generation. And Bryson's basic claim was that all traditional art history, what he regarded as traditional art history, has been dominated by what he calls the natural attitude and idea of the essential copy. Some kind of realism in perceptual terms. And as a critical alternative to this, he wants to posit a semiotic approach, an anti-realist semiotic. This idea of the natural attitude he takes directly from a quote from Edmund Husserl, who wrote, quote, that it is the aim of the sciences of the natural attitude to attain a knowledge of the world more comprehensive, more reliable, and in every respect more perfect than that offered by the information received by experience, end of quote. This is taken by Bryson pretty much out of context, but it of course relates to Husserl's defense of a phenomenological philosophy. Bryson summarizes what he regards to be the natural attitude in art history in 5 points, and I have here quoted from 2 of them. He thinks that this natural attitude is characterized by a centrality of perception and that style is seen as a limitation. So the centrality of perception means, according to Bryson, quote, that the natural attitude is unable easily to account for images that depart from universal visual experience except in negative terms. The painter has misperceived the optical truth or has been unable, through lack of skill or through excess of style, to match optical truth on a canvas. And style as limitation, he defines thus, quote, the essential copy would be immediately and entirely consumed by the viewer's gaze. The same gaze applied to an image that falls short of perfect replication consumes as much of the image as corresponds to universal vision, but will then discover a residue, and by that Bryson means a residue of style, or a deviation from normal perception, indicating the degree of the image's failure and running counter to its whole purpose. End of quote. So, according to Bryson, there is kind of an antinomy or an unresolved paradox in the tradition of art history. That on the one hand, one has taken for granted a realist, or as he writes, perceptualist theory of visual representation, but on the other hand, the notion of style is basic for the writing of art history, the history of the development of different styles. But style is exactly what runs counter to and disturbs this idea of, as he expresses it, the essential copy. Let's see. Now my controls suddenly don't work. You have to edit that out later. I think it's a little bit funny that Bryson is making those claims for traditional art history, identifying it with an ontological approach that he criticizes, and at the same time wanting to advance a semiotic method in art history, which is pretty much based on Saussurean semiotics and Hjelmslevian semiotics, the structuralist Saussurean tradition in semiotics. Because if we look at some very essential central definitions in Saussure's Cours de linguistique générale, I think we can see that how Saussure defines the sign and how Saussure defines what the sign is, so to speak, what the expression or the signifier of the sign is pretty much in accordance with what Bryson describes as the natural attitude. So Bryson's criticism kind of hits back at the very theoretical source that is Bryson's point of departure. And I think he never really realized that. How did Saussure describe the sign? I mean, the linguistic sign, which the structuralist tradition has since tended to generalize to be a definition also of the visual sign. It is the distinction between the signifiant and the signifié, which in combination gives the sign, or the sign, or differently put in this famous diagram by Saussure, the image acoustique in relation to the concept. Funny terminology, the image acoustique, the acoustic image. Quite funny terminology in the context of visual studies, really. And according to Bryson, then, this visual signifier, the signifiant, to speak with Saussurean terminology, would be exactly this style and this material existence or enunciation of the image that is disturbing the perception of a pre-existing image content. The problem here is just that for Saussure, the image acoustique, or the signifier, is not material or stylistic at all, because it is only form, by definition only form and not sound. It is, so to speak, not phonematic, but only phonetic. And also characteristic of what he terms the natural attitude is, according to Bryson, a certain conception of communication, which is exactly the conception of communication that Saussure describes in Cours de linguistique générale, and visualizes it with this famous diagram, which you see to the right at the bottom. That is, the pre-existing content is in the mind of the painter, or in Saussure's linguistic version, in the utterer, the speaker. It is transported to the mind of the beholder by means of the word in spoken language, or the artwork, or image in visual semiotics. So if then this natural attitude is an ideal immateriality of the signifier, of the image acoustique, and a purely mentalist communication model, really, then Saussure indeed represents this natural attitude. And it seems then that the claim Bryson and Ball makes for the semiotic alternative being anti-realist and opposed to the natural attitude really does not have so much substance. Well, that was kind of a digression, but what I really would like to speak about is how have both art historians and indeed semioticians, but often without communicating with art historians at all, conceived of visual art as a system or a grammar. without necessarily making any direct comparisons with linguistic grammar, but as a grammar nevertheless. And then we could pick one of the older art historians that Norman Bryson and Mickey Ball mention as having affinities with semiotics, Alois Riegel. Very interesting figure. He didn't live so long, unfortunately, but during his life he produced he had an astounding production of very high importance, which is still influencing the art history. So, in 1897 and 1898, he was writing an unpublished book manuscript, which he called Historische Grammatik der bildenden Künste. An outright analogy with language. There is a historical grammar of der bildenden Künste, of the visual art, or the pictorial arts, as we would say in English. And this idea he also developed in a series of lectures he held in 1899. Therefore, there are several versions of this book, and the combination of them have been published in English in a translation from 2004 by Soundbooks. This book, which was not even finished, and the work of Riegel in general have had a tremendous impact in art history. And especially the distinctions which Riegel stresses and makes especially clear in this manuscript. And I have listed them here for overview. He has this distinction about tactile perception against painterly or optic perception, which is an opposition which, according to Riegel, structures the whole development of visual representation, or visual art, if we want to speak about art. And it has to do with basic phenomenological relationship between the spectator and the environment, the individual and the environment, to look at something closely, to look at something at medium distance, to look at something at far distance. And this relates to the different mediums of visual representation, from 3D to 2D, sculpture, relief, and finally drawing and painting. What he claims that sculpture relates to close viewing because it is best seen or understood closely, and painting is best understood from afar. So therefore, when he defines a certain rule-bound cycles of development in the history of art, he thinks that there are certain periods, certain cultures, certain art historical periods that are characterized by an art that is meant to be seen from afar, not close, and that is characterized by the artistic mode that he terms painterly or optic, in distinction to haptic. Riegel defines here not so much a grammar, but a system for historical analysis, or a largely speculative schema or scheme for the explanations of stylistic development basically all around the world in all periods of time. Because his main example is the development from early Mediterranean art, Egyptian art, like 3,000 years ago, via so-called classical art, classical Greek art, around 400, 300 before Christ, until the Christian era. And according to Riegel, as for the philosopher Hegel before him, Riegel's theory is heavily dependent on Hegel and Hegelianism indeed. the transfer from antique pagan religions to Christianity meant big fundamental change in worldview and in culture and in art. So basically, he wants to reduce all cases, actually, of stylistic development to 3 stages. A formative stage, sometimes called primitive stage or archaic stage, and a summit stage, which typically for Riegel and his time is represented by Greek antique classicism as the prime example, and finally a stage of decline. And examples of stages of decline could be late Roman art, early Christian art, or after the summit of Renaissance in Europe in the 16th century, the decline of Manierist and Baroque art. So that's quite commonplace in art history, and that's like a generalization that all art history students have to relate to, and which to a large extent still structures how art history is written in standard books. Still, 120 years after Riegel. So to like make concrete what was meant by this theory of developmental cycles, we usually use pictures examples such as this one when we try to teach about this in art history. Examples of the developmental stage and the summit stage and the declining stage, respectively. But then Bryson claims that this has to do with semiotics, and that could be a little bit difficult to see, probably, except that from the perspective of Bryson, probably both semiotics and the theories of Hegel and Riegel are characterized by a high degree of systematicity and a wish to make generalizable conclusions about culture, art, language, or whatever. As regards Bryson's idea that traditional art history and Riegel would belong to one of the founders of traditional art history, is characterized by the natural attitude. That seems to a certain extent to be true if we look at this quote from right at the beginning of Riegel's historical grammar of the visual arts, when Riegel writes the following. I read, quote, the human hand fashions works from lifeless matter according to the same formal principles as nature does. All human art production, in German Kunstschaffen, is therefore at heart nothing other than a contest, in German Wettschaffen, with nature. The sense of delight with which a work of art fills us, commensurate with its human maker's capacity to bring a clear and convincing expression of the respective form and laws of natural creation. In other words, it is in the recognition of the work of art's correspondence to the work of nature to which it refers that the source of all purely aesthetic pleasure lies. End of quote. So, creative man in all ages competes with nature and reveals the structure of nature laws. It seems to confirm quite much with Brysel's idea of traditional art history as obsessed by the idea of the essential copy, that art reveals the essential truth about reality and the world or nature or something, and that it is basically realist. It is in the recognition of the work of art correspondence to the work of nature to which it refers that the source of all purely aesthetic pleasure lies. But we only have to leave to the next page 52 of the book, to see that Riegel nuances this somewhat. He there writes that pictures or language, for that matter, is not nature. it is more about carving out names and concepts from initial chaos. That is what he describes in this passage, which I have quoted, and I read. The creation of visual art is a contest with nature, not a desire for interchangeability with nature. Man can never produce a perfect illusion, in German Täuschung, which actually doesn't exactly mean illusion, but anyway, or counterfeit, in German Fälschung, of nature. This is true with regard not only to animate natural beings, whose life breath the human creator cannot infuse into dead matter, but even to the shapes of dead matter itself. If a crystal were to be artificially reproduced with the most meticulous accuracy, for example, microscopic investigation would still instantly reveal the arrangement of its most minuscule parts to be incompatible with those of natural crystal. End of quote. And it seems like basically ontologically, Riegel's opinion about the relation between art and reality, so to speak, is not a simple reflection theory. Like in Bryson's interpretation, it would probably be. But it's not a simple reflection theory or a simple, naively realist theory. It is probably more akin to what we would call philosophically a nominalist theory of knowledge, a nominalist epistemology. In another place, page 409, Riegel writes the following as some kind of creation myth of representation and art in general. He writes, quote, "Peering out at the world around him, primitive man found himself confronted with chaos. Into that chaos he sought to bring order. The first step was to pull forward the things that held special attraction, so that in place of a muddled, chaotic mass, he had before him individual entities. Here we return to the basic outlook of all ancient people. Natural things are embodied individuals." End of quote. So there's also a strongly anthropological aspect to these writings by Riegel. He is very well aware of scholarship in anthropology and archaeology of his time, and always relates these studies of stylistics, styles of art, that was his main occupations, to the emerging research fields of anthropology and archaeology. But what he describes then, like as the basic creation myth, so to speak, of visual art, is that in the beginning we see only chaos, and language and concepts and myths are coming into the picture to help this primitive man, as Riegel wrote, typical for his times, to bring order into this chaos. And isn't that, and this is a question I just pose rhetorically, isn't that basically the same as what Saussure described in the Cours de linguistique générale about the relationship of, here in the diagram, A, which is then what Saussure terms the nebulous world of the thought, that our thoughts and thereby our world is chaos, basically, and it has no order before we are starting to form words, focus on concepts, write texts probably, to add a structure to this chaos. This diagram is famous. It pretty much summarizes the Saussurean conception of the relationship between the expression of language, or the image acoustique, which is B, and le plan indéfini d'idées confuses, which is A. So, for being a quite then traditional art historian, probably, it seems that Riegel's thought and Riegel's epistemology at its foundations, it's actually not very dissimilar to that of the founder of modern linguistics and semiotics, de Saussure. But then comes the analysis of the visual. And the terms used in the analysis of the visual. Which also means that in art history, as a specialized field, there has developed a certain terminology, which is sometimes at odds with the terminology of linguistics and the terminology of what we now refer to as visual semiotics. And that probably especially is true of the term of the plastic, or in German, plastische. For most art historians, it is self-evident that with plastic we mean exactly what Riegel himself describes in this quote. The plastic is a quality of a work of art in 3 dimensions, which reflects, so to speak, the embodied experience we have in natural everyday perception of a 3-dimensional object. And there Riegel sees a very clear development from Egyptian art, exemplified by this statue, from the mid-2nd millennium before Christ, of the Egyptian ruler Khafre. From that kind of sculpture, which is basically a combination of 4 planar views. Everything is rigid, everything is supposed to be seen right from the front, in comparison with the later Greek art, in which Riegel sees that this conflict, so to speak, between a planar view of the object, planar 2-dimensional view of the object, and a fully round, fully 3-dimensional view of the object has been resolved. But that is what Riegel meant with the term plastic, and which he, like most other art historians actually, even today, opposes quite strictly to the notion of pictorial art or painted art or 2-dimensional, purely 2-dimensional. As you have probably noticed, Riegel's idea about the historical grammar of visual art is quite both anthropological and cultural, but also a psychological theory. And the same goes for our Belgian friends, the group Me, of which I think only Klinkenberg and Edelin are active nowadays. And their major contribution they made to visual semiotics in 1992, when they published the Traité du Sein Visuel, the Treatise of the Visual Sign. And I here simply have put in what I think is their understanding of the term plastic or plastique, which I think is a quite French notion. It is not related to any specific medium, like for Riegel it had to do with sculpture more than painting, but for Group Me the term plastic has to do with visual stimuli in general. in a psychological sense. And what you see here is their model, basically, of visual semiotics, reduced to a flowchart. Reduced to the basic relationship between perception and conception, which you saw that Riegel described more than 100 years ago when he speculated about the initial chaos of visual reality being structured by cultural concepts. And that you also have seen Saussure described. So there are three basic aspects of the plastic in terms of the visual information that reaches our cognitive system through the eyes, and that is texture and shape and color in Group Me's taxonomy, which is processed in the brain by different neurological functions. Something that is a commonplace fact for brain science today, because today science has been able to in detail get into these different neurological functions that are here referred to as microtopographic processors, motivic extractors, and chromatic processors, and so on. And it has been the vision of Group Me to always relate to and update their theory in relation to cognitive semiotics, what we call cognitive semiotics, cognitive science, and brain science, or brain neurology, simply. And then there is something they call the plastic sign, which is probably quite synonymous, but not quite, to what art historians usually call form. And then there is something they call the iconic sign, a term derived from Peirce's terminology of the icon, the iconic sign, that is related to this, explicitly related to this comparison between perceptual sensory information and stored concepts, stored knowledge about the common objects of our natural world. So an overview of Group Me's theory of the visual sign and the relationship between the plastic sign, sign plastique, and the iconic sign, sign iconique, would look like this, I think. We have the plastic sign, we have the iconic sign, and the status of the plastic sign is not very clear. It is unstable, because we can easily say what is the content of the iconic sign and the iconic rhetoric of the iconic sign. Simply because when we see a picture which is representational and not abstract, we can say that, oh, I can see what it represents. It looks like reality, like in Norman Bryson's famous Natural Attitude. But what is the content of the plastic sign? If the plastic sign is nothing but, in the terms of Group Me, a system of shape, a system of color, and a system of texture. What is the content of that? And actually, Group Me in the Traité du Design Visuel have tried to answer that question, but probably in a rather schematic fashion. As I put it in my abstract for this talk, probably in a too a prioristic fashion. As if these systems they describe would be basically the same, work in the same way, have the same meaning in all cultures, when what they are describing in Traité du Design Visuel is probably merely systems of Western visual culture. Similar criticism has been formulated by Göran Sonesson, the late Göran Sonesson, in his many comments on the work of Group Me. And then finally, and probably most relevant actually for the comparisons between these theories in visual semiotics and the traditions and the field of art history, what Group Me called the iconoplastic rhetoric. Rhetoric, iconoplastic, which means that the plastic system and the iconic system interact rhetorically, adding content to each other in a cooperation or in a dialectic, if you want. Then they are talking about system. They are actually talking about systems of shape and color and texture, and when it comes to this system of shape, this system has 3 subsystems, which one can visualize as this. And it's actually quite complicated system about things which we usually probably take for granted or think are very simple. It is basically about how you place different elements in a delimited visual spatial field, or in French, font. It is the system of the position of elements, the orientation or direction of elements, and the size of elements. And I don't think I have time to expand so much more on this, but if you're interested, I very warmly refer you to the Traité du Design Visuel, in which these matters are treated in a most meticulous fashion. A simple example, which is also more related to content and iconology, of how actually such simple things as the position and the direction and size of objects in the picture affect content, we can take from traditional Christian iconology, such as this simple example, which is a propaganda woodcut by Lucas Cranach the Younger, who worked for the German Lutheran Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, and which actually follows rules for Christian iconology or iconography in the medieval ages in Europe. And here we can also say that it is a greatly rhetorical image. What Group Me want to analyze and make clear with their treatise is how the rhetoric of the image is always related to the formal structure, the formal composition of the image. You see Martin Luther in the middle. He is clearly the most prominent one. That has to do with the size of the element in the picture that represents Martin Luther. You see the placement to the right and to the left. And these placements are in according to the codes of Western iconography in the medieval ages, related to the values of good and evil. The evil ones, that is, of course, then in the Lutheran interpretation, the Catholics, they happen here to be at the right in the picture, and the good ones, that is the congregation of Martin Luther, is to the left. Interesting here, though, which adds another semiotic layer, is that the axiological differentiation between right and left is traditionally that the right is the good side and the left is the bad side. But here you can see it is the other way around. It is due to what is sometimes referred to in iconography as the heraldic effect, that the point of view here is supposed to be interpreted as not the point of view of you who watch, but the point of view of the central or focal actor in the picture, namely Martin Luther, from his point of view, from inside the image. This is the left side, and that is the right side. But these distinctions, which are systematic in traditional iconography, are related to certain formal conditions, like the delimitation of a framed field and the various positions within that field. This is something that has not existed always. Such a self-evident thing as when we are told to draw something, we pick a piece of paper. That piece of paper is rectangular. It has the proportions according to a well-known classical mathematical ratio, the root of 2, right? And that is like something we take for granted, but it is of course a cultural convention. There is a cultural relativity to this delimited picture field. Group Me also write about what I call the rhetoric of the frame, how the framing of the picture, and sometimes the frame as meant as a part of the picture, influences the content. Jacques Fontanille, whom I would say belongs to the Semiótica school, has written an interesting article which I think I put as a reference in my abstract, which is about the archaeology and anthropology of the plastic dimension, as he called it. And he thinks that there is a possible connection between the development of rectangular picture fields and religious culture in the Roman world, the early Roman world, also the Etruscan world, the divinatory practices in that culture. Because there, Fontanille claims, and he also there refers to Italian archaeology, which such sites have been excavated. The tradition of the temple started, what we call today the temple. But the temple was originally just a marked site. A marked site, a rectangular marked site. From within, the priest or augur predicted the future by relating the grid of this marked site at the ground to the cardinal directions of the sky and the movement of birds and clouds in the sky. I think one may probably say that Fontanille's article is a little bit speculative, but I think it's a very interesting article, and he puts forward a quite interesting hypothesis that historically this thing which we tend to take for granted, the development of a delimited picture field, could be related actually to these kind of practices. I'm sure that is also something that would have interested the art historian, Jewish American art historian Meyer Schapiro, had he been alive today. It has sometimes been claimed that the whole production of Meyer Schapiro, the whole research of Meyer Schapiro, had to do with a crisis of meaning in art history, meaning that those art historians that mainly focused on the form of art, and those art historians in Panofsky's iconological tradition who mainly focused on the content of art, tended to drift apart and have less and less contact. Most of Meyer Schapiro's incredibly rich production, full of ideas, ends up with the conclusion that one should study visual form in the sense of what semioticians like the Group Me refer to as the plastic language or even the plastic sign. One should study that, but not in isolation. Not for form as form's sake, but as expressive of narrative structure, mythological meaning, of content, simply put. And that there is a danger of pure formalism. Here are some important texts by Schapiro. The earliest one from 1929 and the latest one from 1973, which was actually published as part of the Greuter's serious approaches to semiotics. And I have been writing about this in an article I published myself. But one can see here that Schapiro both himself studies such diverse subjects at Romanesque art in French churches from the 11th and 12th century. And he also constantly comments upon and criticizes his colleagues. For example, his criticism of Alfred Barr Jr.'s famous book on artistic modernism from 1936, where Schapiro here thinks that Barr has completely disregarded the fact that in Malevich's art there was a development, and that such a picture as the very simple one to the down left you see cannot be described in purely formal terms, as Barr describes it. Barr described it as usually as just two cubes in which the lower, smaller red one has a more dynamic orientation than the upper one. That you could call some kind of plastic sign probably, but in that sense as a sign, as a visual abstract or plastic sign. It has, so to speak, only visual content. So there is like the question, what is, or if there is a purely visual or purely plastic sign, what is in that case the content of that sign? And I think Shapiro's argument is that he finds that content in the context of how modernism developed. How, for example, Malevich's more purely abstract style developed for the paintings such as this one, Woman with Water Pails, which 2 years earlier, or 3 years earlier, depending on how you date it. And it has to do with primarily with the preoccupation with balance. I will not comment on this diagram here. We can probably, if you have questions about that, you could do it later. And similarly, Schapiro wrote a highly critical review of what we could call a purely formalist analysis of Shapiro's own field of expertise, namely Romanesque art in French churches, where, according to Schapiro, Baltrushaitis, the Lithuanian scholar active in Paris at that time, in his doctoral thesis from 1931, basically imposes abstract structures on art, ecclesiastical art, with a total disregard of what these works were actually supposed to mean, and also with a total disregard of their actual outlook and structure. A little bit like how famously the medieval architect Villard de Oncourt liked to play around with drawing first representational pictures and then imposing various schematic geometric diagrams on them. It could have such a consequence as this. Which is Baltrushaitis' analysis in his doctoral thesis of the tympanum of the main portal of the Vézelay church in France, one of the most famous medieval artworks in art history and in art historical overviews generally. And what has Baltrushaitis done here? One of the main claims that he put forward is that there is a correspondence between part and whole in this period of European art, and especially in these tympanums. So he had taken a small detail from the tympanum, the one you see encircled up here, from the frame, and then created a geometrical diagram from it, but as Schapiro points out, completely misrepresented the structure of the ornament, and then imposed geometrical analysis on the structure of the central scene, which, by the way, represent Christ and the disciples at Pentecost. This is, according to Schapiro, what happens when you kind of divorce form and content in art history. I think I have to end this talk, otherwise it will be too long, but I'll just check. Do you see this slide properly?
Yes, we still see the portal, the tympanum of the main portal of Vesile.
Do you see the diagram imposed on the tympanum?
Yes.
Quite striking, huh?
Mm-hmm.
What did he mean with this, actually?
Yeah, I was asking myself.
Well, yeah. So I have added a number of other slides also, but I think as a final argument, I have myself found it very interesting reading Shapiro's studies, which are pretty old by now, from a semiotic perspective, because I think he constantly demonstrated in his own medieval studies and in his criticism of other scholars and critics the importance of exactly what Group Me describes when they describe what they call the iconoclastic rhetoric, which is totally based on what Schapiro and other art historians and Riegel and most art historians call form and content, simply. In most art history texts you read, the plastic sign, according to Group Me, is simply the form of the artwork, and the iconic sign is the content of the artwork. But these are both signs, according to Group Me. And their visual semiotics of this kind markedly differs from how most art historians would talk about it. But then we have this crucial thing, the interaction between form and content, or between the iconic and the plastic. And finally, this article which Schapiro wrote for Semiotica in 1969, which is called On Some Problems in the Semiotics of Visual Art, Field and Vehicle and Image Science. A very short text, just a very short text, in which Schapiro kind of summarizes everything he knew, everything he had written before about modernist art, about abstract expressionism of America in his own generation, and about medieval art, and about antique art and late Roman art. Summarized it as in a general theory about the basic, as he calls it, non-mimetic elements of art. But I mean, not as something to be studied in isolation, but always something to be studied in relation to other semiotic levels and other aspects of the artwork. I just briefly quote as an end that no, I think I have mixed up my PowerPoint slides here, actually. No, I have not.
No, we can see your slides here.
There is something I have forgotten here, actually. There is something I have forgotten. But the point Schapiro had is probably especially clear in relation to his criticism of Baltrusitis in 1931, because this rather formalist idea of Baltrusitis was that there is always what he described as an isomorphy between part and whole. And he always had to demonstrate it in a schematic way like this. His idea was like that these abstract structures, which he deduced from some detail in the picture, a rather peculiar method, determined the style of the work, determined how the work was to look like. But Schapiro's main objection is there, but okay, this is not very founded on a systematic method. And how could one claim that there is only one element that is determinant, that is determining the structure of the work? There must be an interaction between form and content between them. So I think I close there. So open for comments and questions. I think I had a little bit too much material actually. So Andy.
You prepared for a course.
Yeah.
Can we open for questions?
Can open for
or
questions.
Comments? Yeah. Então, pessoal, quem quiser fazer perguntas, comentários, qualquer manifestação, pode ser, se não quiser falar inglês, eu posso dar uma ajuda. Se quiser escrever, pode escrever no chat.
Someone raised the hand.
Clarissa, please.
Hello. Good afternoon. I believe it is afternoon there, Professor. Not sure. I would like to thank you for your talk, because some of the things that you pointed actually I can relate to, because as though I'm a semiotician, my undergraduate degree, so to speak, was in visual arts.
Mm-hmm.
So when you mentioned Panofsky, I found it very interesting, because indeed the pre-iconographic level it's a very important thing when we study in art. But although I've seen in some semiotic texts, it's not that much, how can I say, explored. Much more attention, I believe, it is given to the later two stages, iconographic and iconology.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
That is so, but I don't think it was Panofsky's intention, because you remember he had a very long career. He started in Germany. He had to flee Germany, of course, because he was from a Jewish family. But before that, he published a widely acclaimed study, which is called The Perspective as Symbolic Form.
Oh, yes, I have this.
That is actually about exactly these things that Riegel is trying to explain, that Schapiro is trying to explain more from a historical materialist perspective. How, so to speak, the grammar of the picture, the formal rules of the picture have a certain symbolic function also.
Yes, and
carry a content.
I would like to risk a guess, because, as I said, from my experience in visual arts, in academia and visual arts, the iconographic model of iconological model of Panofsky deals a lot with form. But I think that in art, sometimes that vision brings forth a focus on formalism and less attention somewhat to the conceptual aspects. And when you were saying that there's this distance between the semiotical view and the formalist view, I think that it's because of those different approaches, different visions. Because, as I said, I very much like Panofsky's theories, but I was also thinking from a perspective of someone that is a bit in between, as to say. So that was my perception, especially when you were talking. And again, I would like to thank you very much for your words. And I hope to actually read a lot of the the references that you brought. I thought it was very, very interesting, especially Regal, that I didn't know. I thought it was kind of interesting, but mostly Schapiro. I didn't know Schapiro at first, and I'm gonna look out for it.
Not so many people have read Regal anymore, not even art historians, you know. His work is inaccessible in many ways. Also purely linguistically, because there are not so many good translations.
Oh, okay. But yeah, I think it's at least from what I could perceive from what you said, it is very much an object, a product of its time.
Very much so, and it's so Hegelian.
Yeah. So
this developmental scheme of archaism, classicism, and manierism, if you like, it is exactly the scheme of Hegel in his Introduction to Aesthetics.
Yes. But Schapiro, I didn't know, and I really want to look out for some more works from him. So I appreciate you for bringing.
He was very productive, and at the end of his life, he kind of ran into a conflict with this younger generation of art historians who regarded themselves as semioticians. Because Panofsky regarded himself as an empiricist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there you had it. That was it was bound to be trouble between them.
Yes.
But I think he has had kind of a renaissance the last 10, 15 years. A lot of theses have been written about him. And, other meta texts have been written about his work.
Yes. Thank you.
Mais alguém gostaria de fazer algum comentário, pergunta? Então eu vou fazer um enquanto vocês pensam se tem algo a perguntar. While we wait for people to well, I must say what you bring us is a lot of information we're not used to dealing with. So it's a lot of Clarissa that studied visual arts before, okay, but for most people it's a lot of new things at the same time. So we still have to organize the ideas to ask you a question. But I would like to ask you just a limited question based on a sentence from the beginning of your presentation. When you were talking about Bryson, you mentioned style as limitation. And perhaps because I have another, well, I would like you to talk about a little more about this. Why limitation? Why style as limitation, this connection, you know? It was not clear to me because I don't know about the background, I believe.
Now I can speak more freely than in the presentation. My idea of Bryson is that he is actually a formalist who poses as a semiotician. Because all the time he has been pushing are arguing for the importance of the sensuous dimension of the image, the material, the bodily dimension, the like against especially the tradition of Panofsky's iconology and its total focus on content, you know. And I think it's funny that for me it seems like that his criticism of traditional art history is at the same time a criticism of the structuralist tradition that he claims to be from. Because if you like, we could probably agree among ourselves that it's quite different experience to look at an artwork, and especially a sculpted or painted artwork, than it is from saying or hearing a word. So, I mean, if you reduce the meaning potential of the artwork, it's like the optical, the spatial, the if you have sculpture, it is also all the things going around the sculpture, and so on and so forth. If you reduce it to just something similar to Saussure's description of the image acoustique or the linguistic sign, there it seems that there is not so much left. And Bryson's whole work has been geared towards bringing that in somehow. But then then there is a contradiction between that and his strict adherence in some respect to some quite structuralist, quite Saussurean conception of semiotics, which he's also referring to Peirce. He's also referring to a whole lot of French post-structuralist visual theory in the 80s, that Deleuze and others that also were more interested in the American Peircean tradition, but then at the same time he seems to regard it as something else than it is really. So
maybe you make me think that perhaps he had too high an opinion of himself. Sorry, I never read him.
yeah, but I mean, he basically claims that traditional art history has a naive epistemology and has disregarded style. And then you look at the whole big tradition of analysis and history of style in art history, how it has totally dominated art history in certain quarters. I mean, it seems like a very strange claim, at least to me. And then Bryson also came with another book, which was very important, Word and Image, it is called.
Word and Image.
And I think various publications and even a journal dealing with word and image has been basically named after that book. Its subtitle is French Painting in the Age of l'Ancien Régime. French painting in the 17th and 18th centuries. And there he says that he makes this distinction between what he calls the discursive and the figurative. That kind of two poles between which art always oscillates or fluctuates, according to Bryson. And this theory is very simple to describe. He does it in a very clear way in the beginning of his book. As a standard example of the discursive, we have a medieval glass window, which only aim is to show certain theological concepts, that is, discursively. And as an extreme example of the figurative, what he terms the figurative, we have abstract expressionism in America in the 1950s, such as Pollock. The total dominance of the discursive and the total dominance of the spontaneous gesture or whatever.
It seems to me that it's almost the opposite of what Group Mu says. The plastic sign, about the plastic sign and the iconic sign. You know, the window, the telling a story would be iconic. It refers to something already known. And,
It refers to something already known. But it's like if we should translate Bryson's terminology into Group Me terminology, then the totally figural artwork would be 100% plastic, but it is then a sign that has no content. And this is something he derives from the aesthetic philosophy of François Lyotard, actually. And something that Group Me criticizes in Traité in 92. But without mentioning Bryson, I don't think they are aware of Bryson.
Thank you.
Betty, there is a question in the chat
Thank
posed
you.
by Ivan, Professor Ivan Lopes. I think he's a bit shy to voice it, but it's there.
Thank you, Renata. So, Fred, you can see it in the chat, but I'm going to read it aloud. In your experience of teaching art, do you think that the reception of semiotic perspectives is becoming easier or more difficult in the art historical milieu as the years go by?
It's becoming more and more difficult because of all the misunderstandings. And I would say the lack of insight in our field in semiotics and in the various disciplines and schools of semiotics that have developed. And visual semiotics developed very fast. Like Group Me only represents the beginnings now. Now we have all kinds of very interesting developments, but largely unknown to art historians, I would say. And I think the opposite is also true, probably. But I'm probably swearing in the church here. There has also been a great suspicion, often among art historians, against semiotics, if not even against theory in general.
So would you say against theory in general, perhaps? Would you, yes? Or because you said a suspicion against semiotics?
There's in some quarters. I mean, Panofsky has become so extremely influential in art history because his ideas are not so difficult to grasp. I mean, if you think about it, they're quite self-evident, really. We have a picture, you see what it represents. It is represented in a certain style, that's the primary level. Then you have some significations that are only attainable to people with cultural knowledge. That's the secondary level. That you have the third level, which is more complicated because it has to do with what Panofsky calls synthetic intuition, which is a very vague concept. But that still makes sense in the field of the humanities because people often want to talk about how a visual culture, how certain artwork kind of expresses more general ideas that are specific to the time, certain ideologies, certain religious beliefs, and so on and so forth. But it is often said that in actual practice, most iconologists and also Panofsky himself remained with this in this first and second level. Actually.
Okay.
So and for already that is quite complicated. If you want to be an iconologist today, you have to have all this knowledge about myths and religion, even if we limit ourselves to only Christian culture. And that is a rather Eurocentric approach today. But even if we limit ourselves to that, it is kind of enough, because it is actually a language that you have to learn as an art historian. That is just like learning a new language. And there are very few people who kind of can speak with confidence about those traditions today. I for sure cannot. They also have art history is also often here in the north. Art history and similar subjects are often referred to as tradition subjects, all cultural heritage subjects.
Oh.
And that
Well,
is pretty. That is quite significant part of the identity of many art historians.
oh, I see.
And probably that's why this world of art in general, the disciplines of art in general, is not necessarily very welcoming to theories that are more concerned with generalizing movements of meaning construction, right? Because it's more traditional, it's more specific, and etc. And then when it comes to trying to visualize the general movements of meaning construction, then it's something that goes out of their range of interests, and then people like that become kind of enemies of what they have to say. Is it so? Is it something like that? Because it's something that I'm trying to understand here what you're saying about it.
Yeah, and someone else comments here that I think there is a concern that it might sterilize art. Yeah, but that's a very common concern in general, both in academia and in the art world, right? That it will be too much theory, and we will have less art. Whatever art is. I mean, all these concepts we are dealing with in my subjects are quite slippery, actually. What is form? What is art? What is style? What is... and when it comes to very general theories or a strong tendency to systematize and generalize, probably people in my field have become suspicious of that, because they have seen the consequences of too schematic historical models, like that cyclical model of Riegel, for example. So that was a long time ago, but I can very well imagine that it is still affecting how people think today in my field. The general suspicion against general theory, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can hear suspicion against French semiotics at the University of São Paulo, at least, from literature teachers, professors. I'm sure they never read any of the analysis, especially produced by Denis Bertrand. Anyway, but to see the potential French semiotics offers for analysis, but they say, no, this is going to kill the literary part. A more general theory like semiotics would extract everything that is literary and see the text. I don't know, some crazy ideas here. Prejudice, but that started a long time ago with something else, and it passes on. As you said, to find the origin is difficult. By the way, it's not anything related to art or anything, but this idea of being, when we arrive somewhere, we are part of, we become part of, let's say, a context that has a history. You know, I had that experience even in my working life when I worked at the Catholic University here in Brazil, in São Paulo. And I found out that I was caught in the middle of a fight that had taken place 20 years before. Yeah, so people who entered through a context would never get to teach graduate students. To teach graduate students, you would have to enter through another channel, because the two sides, 25 years before, each one dominated one of the parts. And you you go there, you arrive, and you, oops, this scission exists, and we don't know. It took me ages to understand it was a fight that had taken place 25 years before. You know? But you know, like getting to university, and as a student, you have a professor who says, semiotics, French semiotics or not, has nothing to contribute to literature or to literature studies. Okay, if you learn that, you have to deconstruct that to be able to look at things again from a different point of view. We are caught in it's like
such claims are very strange. Did you think about it? I mean, do they imply to mean then that the work of Greimas, for example, has done nothing for narratology?
Some people in literature, in the English area at least, that is the one I work with, they are certain of that. A few of my master students, even PhD students, heard that in the classroom. Yeah. Okay. So
here, no one would say that because everyone is so nice and quiet here, but they probably think it. Yeah.
Perhaps in Brazil we are less nice, less quiet. But they don't say that in front of us. They say that to students. I learned it from students.
That is also typical.
Yeah. Anyway, let's see if there are any more questions, because it's night for you. Yeah. So
no, it's not bad. Actually, it is never night here this time of year.
That's true. What time does the sun set? If it does.
Well, this is a little bit to the south still, but in Turku it is pretty much, I think the sun sets probably at 11 in the evening, something like that.
And rises?
2 or something.
Okay.
And in the very upper north, it never sets, and that's a very, very strange experience.
I imagine, of course, the opposite in winter. It never.
And in the opposite, the sun never rises.
Let me check if there are any more questions. Yeah, and see.
Dramatic. It's a culture that opts for a lot of binary thinking. Big contrast.
Yeah, perhaps it's inserted in the genes. I don't know. Pessoal, tem mais perguntas? Eu estava falando que lá é noite, né? E o Fred falou que lá quase nunca é noite nessa época. E embora ele esteja um pouco mais ao sul, que lá na Finlândia, na universidade lá, o sol se põe lá para umas 11 da noite e nasce umas 2 da manhã nessa época do ano. Dizendo, né, implying, né, que a gente pode continuar, porque por ele tudo bem, mas já são 5 para as 4 aqui. Se tiver mais alguma pergunta, por favor, façam, senão a gente pode agradecer, dispensar o Fred, ver quais são os avisos para o mês que vem. Né?
Someone said sent a ResearchGate link. Okay, I see. Take a look at that.
Eu was Ivan. Thank you. Obrigada, Ivan. Well, I think, it's now, we are reaching our limit. That is, we have 4 minutes to our limit, maximum limit normally. So I think it's time to thank you, to express our gratitude and pleasure for having had your presence here. Yeah, and hope to see you in person soon.
I always end with saying thank you and sorry, because I seem unable to keep time limits. But if you say that much of the information was new to you, probably it was good that I had quite information-rich slides and so on.
Tell me, is that a Swedish expression? Thank you and sorry.
Yeah,
I watched a Swedish film last night called like that.
Thank you and sorry is Swedish and also Finnish expression, I think.
Okay. So thank you very much and hope to see you as soon as possible. You see the people applauding you.
Hope so too. There is a semiotics conference here in Lund in Sweden in August, but it's cognitive semiotics.
Yeah.
Also session there for the memory of our professor here, Göran Sonesson.
How do you pronounce his first name?
Göran.
Göran. I always said Göran.
But that's understandable because it's like this very, very fine nuances and differences between different Nordic languages and so on.
Yes. Thank you.
That's okay.
Okay. Bye then. Oh, sorry.
And thank you very much for your interesting questions.
Thank you. Are there? Yes. Is there information to pass on to the group?
Yeah, just well, I would like to thank you as well, Professor Andersson, in the name of the group of semiotic studies here at USP. It was great to hear everything you brought us today. And I just have a very little announcement to make for the next session of FAPS, which is going to count with the presence of Valdomiro Vergueiro, who is a professor here at the University of São Paulo, and he is a researcher on comics. He's actually the coordinator of what we call Observatory of Comics here in Brazil, and he's going to be here with us on the 28th of June. So everybody's invited as well. Okay? And thank you again. Era isso, Beth. Tchau, então, gente. Muito obrigada. Espero contar com vocês no dia 28 de volta. Até.
Boa tarde. Have a nice weekend, all of you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Have a nice weekend.
Nice meeting you, Fred.
Yeah, likewise. Hope we meet again soon.